Hey, so in the last few videos that I've done, I've shown you bits and pieces of my workflow for how I take a song that I've got in Ableton, slice it up into a bunch of loops, work out how I'm going to translate those loops into various patterns and parts in the Octatrack, and then recreate that song in the Octatrack with the purpose of either doing further changes to it or taking it out live and playing it with the Octatrack to get away from the laptop. So in this video, we're kind of going to roll together all of those little techniques and tips and tricks that I was working on to work out how to do this and how to do it in a repeatable and sane manner. And I'm going to take you through the entire process from the track that I've got in Ableton, and we're going to reassemble it completely as is on the Octatrack and then mess around with it a little bit. So this is going to be a long one, so grab a cup of tea, settle in, and I hope you enjoy this. So we're going to start with the, let's start in Ableton here. Now this song in Ableton, putting my headphones kind of half on so I can hear a little bit of what's going on here, but not the god-awful echo that I get of myself. All right, so here's the song in Ableton. Let's zoom in a little bit so that it's, you can see it more. Pretty simple song. When we look through it, the first thing we want to do is try and get an idea for the various different patterns and parts, and then the loops that we're going to chop up to recreate this song in Ableton. Now, before I started this, I've done a bit of work to clean up the project to try and make sure that everything, all the parts were, nicely in time. I recorded these the audio for these a while ago, so this was like before I had a proper MIDI setup that didn't have 30 to 40 milliseconds of latency, and a bunch of other things that really needed to be cleaned up. And I've also gone through and grouped the individual tracks here into groups. So we've got the drum group here, we've got a lead 2, bass, pads, and TB03 for our 303 part. Obviously, it's much easier to do this if you put in invest the time up front to clean up your project and get it sort of well organized like this. It makes it so much easier to try and wrap your head around how you're going to take it from Ableton and put it into the Octatrack. So here's where we are. So if you haven't already, check out the first couple of videos I posted about my workflow as I was still sort of learning how to do this. I talk a lot about why I do things like laying out, locators here for all the patterns and parts and the naming scheme, and you kind of get a sense for how this workflow has evolved. But let's get started. So we've got drums, lead 1, lead 2, bass, pads, and TB03. So the goal here is to recreate this in the Octatrack such that drums is one track, lead is another track, lead 2 is another track, then a track for bass, track for pad, track for 303. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tracks. So that'll fit nicely. That'll leave me one track free for a looper, so that I can do some nice transitions between the patterns when I'm playing live. And track 8 will be available as the master. The first thing I want to do is try to get a sense of how I'm going to reassemble this into patterns on the Octatrack. Now, remember our limitations here on the Octatrack. Well, the Octatrack has 16 banks. Each of those banks has 16 parts within, Octatrack has 16 banks. Within each bank you have 16 patterns, and within each bank you also have 4 parts. Now, parts is something I didn't spend nearly enough time getting my head familiar with before I started on the Octatrack, and that cost me a lot of frustration and lost time. So it's important to understand a part is like a profile of samples. So you might have one set of samples or loops that define like the intro of your song, and that's part 1, and that maybe spans 3 or 4 patterns as you bring things in and out. Then maybe you have a verse part of the song, and that's another part, which again is a different set of samples from the intro. Maybe it's a couple of patterns for when you start the verse and in the middle of the verse and in the out of the verse. And then again, maybe you've got a chorus, and the chorus would be another part, because again, it's going to be a different set of samples that you use across a number of one or more patterns to build a song up. So to keep ourselves sane here, and before we just end up with a bunch of samples and no idea how to rebuild this in the Octatrack, the first thing to do is start thinking about how we're going to build this song up. So when we look through this in when we look at the track here in Ableton, you see I've got sort of like a, from the first 8 bars is just this drone, and there's a little bit of a bass line playing. I think this 303 part's mostly just a little bit of background noise. It's not super important to the song, but we've got 8 bars of a drone that starts. Then we come in with, actually we can play this as we go. So we've got this drone part here, which is just at the start of the song. And then in comes this bass part, which I think it's more of a lead than anything. And that's playing over the top of that drone. Then another 8 bars, and we get this big bass line coming in. And also the kick, most noticeably. That looks like it goes for about 16 bars there. Then we have another sort of meaningful change in the song. We've got a more complicated drum pattern playing. There's 2 parts playing to the lead here, and then the bass line continues, the drone continues, but it's a different clip, so maybe I restarted the drone recording a little bit. This little 303 noise keeps going in the background. Kind of the same for about 8 bars across there. Then there's a change. It's the same sort of set of samples here, but we drop out this part of the lead line, and there's a little lead in here to the next part. Then we drop into 8 bars of, again, this is going to be, well, that actually looks like the same clip there in the bass line, but now we've got this new entrance here, this that comes from the virus. We've got sort of that central part to the song, or a chorus, if you will. And then that's 8 bars of that. Then we're back into this, which is kind of the same profile of samples that we had here. That plays for these 8 bars. Then we're back into this, which is a whole lot like the parts we had playing here. And that plays for 8 bars there, another 8 bars. So we've got 16 bars roughly the same there, and then we start an outro of just fading out or losing various parts as we go. Pretty simple structure, but that'll be good for assembling this back together in the Octatrack without taking too much time. So let's set some locators here. I generally aim for my patterns in the Octatrack to be 4 to 8 bars long. If you're using 4 bars, then that's kind of tidy because you've got 64 steps. 64 steps at quarter note lengths gives you, sorry, at 16th notes gives you 4 bars and 64 steps, so a good resolution to work with. Typically, though, I'm finding myself using 8 bar samples for more sort of the loops that run for a longer stretch of time over the pattern, and then maybe on that track I do a per track number of steps and timing, and then within that pattern there's also a bunch of 4 bar loops that run twice while the 8 bar loop runs just once, and we'll get into how we construct that on the Octatrack because it's a really great way to make use of the patterns. So this 8 bars here, we're going to call this part 1, or pattern 1, part 1. So I add a locator in here, and I just use the notation of like number colon number, and the first number is the pattern, and the second number is the part. Again, we've got 16 patterns to play with and 4 parts spanning those 16 patterns. So this is going to be pattern 1, part 1, that plays for this 8 bars. And so it's going to be 8 bars of this drone playing and also 8 bars of this 303 line playing in the background. Then we're going to have pattern 2 start here. So that's that in our locator. Pattern 2. And I'm still going to use part 1 here because it's the same. It's just an additive thing. Like I'm adding this sample into the mix. I'm not changing the drone, I'm not changing the 303 line, so I don't need to move to another part or another, again, part. Think of part as a profile of samples. So this can be pattern 2, part 1. Now we get to here, and so that's going to run for 8 bars. Now we get to here, and add a new locator. This is going to be pattern 3. Again, part 1, because it's just additive. You know, this is the same bass line as here, as we had in pattern 2. We're adding in this bass line and we're adding in this drum pattern, so no need to change parts. We'll run this. It actually looks like we can run this for the full 16 bars here, because if we look across this entire space here, there's no change in the patterns or the samples that I would want to play, so that's kind of cool. So what that'll mean is we'll have a pattern that runs for 8 bars, but we'll just let it loop twice when we're playing, or maybe even only once if that's what feels right when we're playing it. So that remains pattern 3, part 1 for 16 bars. Okay, now things get a little bit more complicated. So now we've got a different drum pattern here. We've definitely brought in some new loops here or new clips into the lead section. Bass remains unchanged, drone remains unchanged, and the 303 only runs for 8 bars, then stops. So this is why we need a new part here. So I'm going to add a locator here and say this is going to be pattern 4, part 2. Now, why is it part 2? Because in part 1, I'm going to have a sample loaded that's going to play for this drum pattern on the drum track. And I don't want to have to use something like a pattern lock or a trigger lock, as I could do, to say play the sample instead, but that just gets messy. You should really only be using trig locks and sample locks and things like that as a way to really get over and above the functionality that you need. Keep it simple. You know, each track has a sample associated with it. That sample, you've got 4 different parts to play with. Each of those parts changes that sample. So that's why here we're going to say this here pattern 4 is going to use part 2, because part 2 is going to be this sample instead of that sample. It's going to be these 2 samples, or essentially a loop that we're going to record of these, actually just these, of these 2 parts here instead of this. So there's enough difference here to warrant using another pattern. So that pattern, it's another part, sorry, so confusing. Again, parts are profiles of samples, patterns are exactly that, your patterns. So pattern 4, part 2 is going to run for 8 bars. Then when we get here, we've got a change here, so we definitely are going to need another pattern. And we'll work this out later, but I think the only real change here is just the fact that in this section here, instead of in these 8 bars, I've got both of these clips playing in the lead section. I've now got this one. You know, actually, let's take a listen and see if it actually makes much of a difference. Let's just solo this. Okay. Doesn't make a huge difference. So I mean, if we really wanted to, we could do something like, say, you know, for the sake of reassembling this in the Octatrack and avoiding having to use a different part here for such, you know, just 8 bars, we could actually just say, I'm going to, you know, change this song around a little bit, and it's actually going to be the same lead part for that entire 16 bars. But let's come back to that, and you'll see why I'm sort of hesitating at the moment. It's because I'm not sure whether I can burn another part here or not. But either way we slice it, this is definitely going to be pattern 5. I'm just going to say it's going to be XX part for the moment. And that's going to run for 8 bars. This here is going to be another pattern, definitely, and a different part actually, because I've got new sample coming in here. Actually, no, you know what? I've got an idea. This is going to be pattern 6. And if you look at this, this has the gap here in that lead part, and this also has the gap here in that lead part. I think this is just sort of a little bit of an overhang. Yeah, it is. So kind of meaningless. So what we'll do is we'll say this is going to actually be pattern 5, part 3. This will be pattern 6, part 3. And part 3 is going to be defined as using this virus sample and this lead pattern that only has the top lead clip playing, as opposed to part 2, which had both the lead parts there playing. But because this virus part is sort of additive. It's only playing down here. I can only trigger it in this pattern, but it will actually be part of the part. God, I wish I'd found a different name for that. As pattern 6 and 5 here. So pattern 6 is going to run for these 8 bars here. Now there's a little fill that comes in here. We'll get to fills in a sec. They're kind of the bits that I do last because it's just an extra bit of complexity that you don't need to deal with just up front. We'll add a locator. What are we up to? Pattern 7. Now at this point, I'm back to having the simple drum part that I had in part 1. I've got some complexity here. I've got the more complicated lead part from part 2. I don't have any bass part. I've got the same drone. I've got the same background 303. I'm going to go ahead and call this part 4, knowing that I do only have 4 parts, and I hate being down to 4, having used all 4 already. But if we look ahead here at what we're going to do when we get to this section here, this has got the same complicated drum beat as part 2. It's got the same bass line as part 2. It's got the same lead as part 2. It's got the same bass as part 2, the same drone, the same 303. So this will actually end up being a reuse of part 2 here, because it's the exact same sample as the exact same profile of samples as we've got here that we were using in pattern 2 that we're going to use again in what's probably going to be pattern 8. So cool. I think we've economized enough to make it. So we'll say this is pattern 8 and we're going back to part 2. Now that runs for 8 bars, and we'll add in another locator here. This will be pattern 9, and we're still in part 2 here because again it's all the same profile of samples. In fact, you know what, we don't need a locator here at all. Let's delete that locator and we'll just say this is pattern 8, but we're going to let it loop twice. Then from here we'll go into this is going to be our pattern 9, which is where we sort of have an outro that we'll probably end up doing 2 patterns for. In terms of profile of samples here, because this is just the drone and the bass, let's just say this is actually going to use part 1. Pattern 9, part 1, and that runs for 8 bars just to let this sort of... actually, that works out perfectly. Look, because we've got that in part 1, we use just that part of the lead. Excellent. So this really is part 1. So pattern 9, part 1, and then this is going to be sort of just an outro that can loop around. So we'll say this is pattern 10, part 1, and it runs for 8 bars. All right, we have things all carved up in terms of setting locators for where we want this to go. And we're well and truly within our budget for what we can do on the Octatrack. We've got only 10 patterns. We've used all 4 parts, and I think we've gotten away with it without having to use any sort of trigger locks or sample locks, whatever you want to call them, to override the sample for any given part, which is good because those they're easy enough to set up and the concept is intuitive, but when the sample that's going to play is hidden behind that trig and it's not visible in the display, I think that's when you start to easily confuse yourself, especially if you assemble this in a project and then come back to it in days, weeks, months, depends how good your memory is. It might not be obvious to you just how you've constructed this back together. So simplicity is key. All right, so 10 patterns, 4 parts. We've got this all laid out nicely. Now what we need to do is actually start rendering out our samples. So let's do this for the drum parts first. So we have no drum parts until we get to pattern 3 here. In pattern 3, well, actually the drum part here, and you can see from the little tick marks on this clip here that it's actually a 4-bar loop already. So we don't need to output a 16-bar loop for this entire pattern. We don't need a 4-bar, an 8-bar. In fact, we can just get it straight down to, in fact, it's not even 4-bar, it's just a 2-bar pattern here. Is that right? 18? Yes. Now, here's the trick when you're doing this rendering process. Always sample the group, always render from the group, and listen before you cut the sample. this is the region that we want to make the loop for. We'll just take a listen. Yep, loop it so we know what it's going to sound like. One of the things that's good to check is also to turn on your automation markers here and just have a look through. Now, I'm not using hardly any automation here at all, which is unusual, but this is a really simple song. The only automation I'm using is just to bring up the volume a little bit on this drone here. So when we output the loop for this, we'll need to be careful to render it without the automation or render from somewhere else, because we probably don't want to capture that ascending volume there in that loop, just in case, you know, when we're playing it live, maybe we feel like we want to build up something in that moment. We don't want to feel like the volume goes up, 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 and then drops, and then up, up, up in that loop. So always turn on your automation markers and just be very aware of, you know, the dynamics and the profile of what you're actually going to render out. So I've soloed this group. I've had a listen. I know what I'm going to output. It's this loop here for the first drum part. Okay, and we go to the menu up here, File, Export, Audio, Video. In future, I'm just going to do Command-Shift-R because it's much faster. Now here we want to make sure we select selected tracks only, because we only want to render that little bit there. Make sure this looks right. We're starting from bar 17. Yes, we're rendering 2 bars. When I'm rendering out for the Octatrack, I've got the file type set to wave, bit depth 24, did the triangular, never set it to anything else, and export. I've got a folder on my desktop for all these samples. Now, if you remember from the earlier video, I use a naming scheme for my songs whereby, or for my loops, I should say, whereby I start with a number, which is the, it's actually representative of the song within the project or the bank within the project, just a way so that when I've got all these samples from lots of different songs in a project loaded into the sample list in the Octatrack, it's very easy to just scroll through to get a sense of which samples belong to what. Because remember, all of these go in one 128 slot audio pool. And when you've got 128 samples from 3, 4, 5, 6 different songs, it becomes a god-awful mess real fast. So I put a number at the start. This is going to be song, is it 5? I think it's actually 6. So I'm going to start with, so all my samples will start, and all my samples and loops will start with 6. Then I do an identifier for the track. This is drum, so DRM. And then something that will help me remember this. So it's the simple pattern, and always put the length 2 bar. The reason I keep this super small is the display on the Octatrack is very small, and so you only get a couple of characters to play with. The smaller you make this and the more sort of acronym or mnemonic based you make this, the easier you're going to make it on yourself when you're scrolling through the sample list or the audio pool list, and also when you are looking at the display and want to get quickly oriented with which track is playing which sample. In fact, I'm going to make this even smaller and just SMPL 6 drum SMPL for simple 2 bar. Okay, that'll do. Okay, that's rendered out. Another thing that's a really good habit to get into is after you render each of these samples out, just go and actually open them up and quickly play them back. I don't know if this will play. Okay, I can hear that coming through my headphones. So it just makes sure that you have actually rendered out what you expected. You know, sometimes this can be a bit of a tedious process, and sometimes you end up rendering out a loop that was not what you expected it was, and you don't find out until you're on the Octatrack, and then it's a pain because you've got to go and re-render the loop and just surgically place that loop back in. So the more you do now to make sure you've got the quality that and things that you expect to have, the easier you're going to make your life. So that's our first loop. Let's go ahead and cut now the loop for this part here. So this is part 2. Remember, this is a more complicated drum pattern. Now here, we've also got a crash that plays here. I'm going to worry about putting things like crashes and fills and other little one-shot things in later. So rather than rendering the drum loop here and catching, because I render off the group, and I don't want to catch that symbol, so I'm actually just going to render this 2 bars here, which is the exact same pattern. Again, you can see the tick marks that shows you that this is same clip, but or same loop, but it's just looped over and over again. Again, make sure you listen. Yep, that's what we want. Okay, and I just did Command Shift R to bring up the export audio video. Render this out. Now this is, we'll call it, so again, song 6, drums, busy, 2-bar. And I think that's it for the drums. There's actually really only that simple and busy sort of part, and the rest is, you know, there's a little one-shot fill here, and there's the crash. We'll get to those later. So that's it for drums. I like to collapse that away just so I know I'm done with it. Now we'll move on to the lead section, solo the lead, and we'll just take a listen. Now this is a long clip that I recorded. It's actually like a evolving sort of a bit of audio that I created using VCV Rack. And honestly, I did this so long ago, I can't even quite remember what the MIDI pattern is or how often this actually loops or anything like that. So every time I use this, I'm just going to cut it up exactly as is and make these 8-bar loops for it, even though it may well be that there's only 4 bars of pattern here and it's repeating, but I actually don't think that's the case. But either way, it doesn't matter. We're going to be working with 8-bar patterns. So we're going to grab that entire 8-bar bit of audio. We're rendering off the lead 1 group. We've got it soloed. Let's listen. Yep, that's what I want to capture. Render that out, and this time we're going to call it lead 1. And there's again there's sort of like a, well, I guess there's 3 permutations here, isn't there? There's one where it's the lower part, one where it's both, one where it's just the top part, and yeah, that's it. So 3 permutations. So what's a way we'll remember this? It looks like we've got like a soft and a loud and a both. So let's go with, we'll call this soft, and it is 8 bars. Okay. Now the next section here, this is pattern 2, this is pattern 3, it's part 1. So we're going to reuse that same 8 bars that we just rendered out. So I don't need to do anything for this part here. But this now is on to part 2, so let's listen to this. Yeah, so that's a different part, so we're going to render out those 8 bars. And we'll call this both, because it's both parts, both the loud and the soft part. Okay, and then the third part has just the loud part. So again, select that part of the group, render that out, and it's not really loud, but you know, comparatively we've got soft, both, and loud. So we're just, again, it's just, you want to think of something that you're going to easily remember when you're scrolling through a huge list of samples on your Octatrack as to what you're looking for. I suggest you don't call it something like lead 1, 2, lead 1, 3, lead 1, 5, because you'll get to the Octatrack and be like, oh god, which one is 4? What's 3? Is 3 the one with both parts playing? 2 which one was soft? Which one's loud? I mean, you can audition them on the Octatrack, but you just you can save yourself the time now by naming things in a way you'll remember and will make sense. I think that's all we need from the lead, because again, we've got the soft part, we've got both parts, we've got just the loud part. This is just the loud, this is both, this is both. Yeah, that's it. Okay, that's it for lead. Now let's go into lead 2, and lead 2 is this. Lead 2 is just this nice little pattern that we get from the Access virus. Love that thing. So we just want these 8 bars. Let's again have a listen. Yep, that's definitely what we want. Render that out. And I'm just going to call this lead 2. Now, in this case, I've only got 1 loop I use for this, so I usually just call that main. So it's song 6, lead 2, main, 8 bars, render. Yeah, okay. Because I was recording this from the audio input of the virus, it's going to sit here and just make sure that all the other audio sources are quiet. I could get around that by removing or changing the configuration in Ableton such that it understands that I'm no longer actually using an external instrument for this, because we're just rendering that loop there. But just deal with that for now. It did one drop out, but it was only at the start, and that won't be audible. So we'll just say OK. And that's it for lead 2. Now onto our bass section here, and listen, one thing, I can't stand it when my colors don't match up, so I just want this color to match. I want this color to match the track colors, otherwise the world is not right. Is that the right color? No, that's not it. Okay, one more shot of it and then I'll just leave it as long as it's close. Here we go. Okay. So for the bass here, it is literally just the same 4-bar loop of bass here that I recorded from the JP08 in both of these parts here. So we can get away with just one 4-bar loop of this. Let's just, so again, always solo the section that you're working with. Select off the group track and listen before we render. Oops. Turn off the loop. Wait, now see, that's a perfect example of why it's really important to listen to this before you go and render your loop. If I just rendered the loop as it is, even though I'd selected this, we would have just looped around this part here, this first, 2 bars, because I had the loop turned on. It's not until we actually go and listen that I heard that it was looping and knew I had to turn this loop off. Just double check that. Okay, yep, that's the 4 bars of this that we want. Okay, so we select that off the group track, render that, 4 bars. I'm going to call this bass, and again, just main because it's the only thing we're doing. Render that out. All right, we're nearly there. So close that, we're done with the bass. Now the pads, it's just this drone, and the drone runs for, there's kind of these 8-bar sections, I think. It's actually a really long recording of a pattern that I've recorded from the Roland DO5 Boutique, D05. Let's have a listen and see if we can get away with just an 8-bar loop of this. Again, make sure you solo that section. Not doing a good job of following my own rules here. This is going to be a little bit tricky. So there's definitely some variance between those two. So let's carve it up so that we remember that. And what I'm going to do is, it's just sort of a pad sample. It doesn't make a huge difference if we only got sort of the, the 2 sections there, as opposed to what sounds like it was 4 notes or 4 different chords that were playing there. We'll see how it sounds when we reassemble it. We might need to revisit this decision, but for now, to keep things simple, I'm going to say that there is this 8-bar section, which sounds like this. Okay, and that's what we're going to use in part 1. Part 2 is going to use a different sample for the pad, and it's going to sound like this. We're taking up too much time here, but you get the concept. So I'm going to use this for part 1. Now part 2 is used here, so we'll use a different part of the droney sort of pad. Part 3 is again different, so we can get a bit of variation by using a different sample again. That'll be the same here because these are also using part 3 here. Now, this is part 3, this is part 4, so I'm going to cut this in the middle and we'll use that for part 4. And it's probably not going to be a perfect representation of this because I'm pretty sure this was just like a one-shot recording of this same sort of slow looping pattern over and over again. But, you know, sometimes these lead to the happy accidents that you're looking for when you take a song out of Ableton and into an Octatrack. Let's see if that's what we get here. So we're going to do a 8-bar loop for the pads for part 1. Now I'm going to look at this and say, didn't you just tell me not to do that? But so we'll say it's pad. Now, because I literally just arbitrarily picked a part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4 loop for this, I'm simply going to call it part 1, and it is 8 bars. And then we're going to do the same for part 2. And then for part 3 section. And then for part 4. And that's it. So now we've basically created 4 different slices of this long running drone or pad, so that we can have a bit of variation when we reassemble these patterns and parts in the Octatrack. Might not be a perfect representation of what we had in Ableton, but you know, the other thing we could do here is we could take this entire thing, render it out as, what's that, 96. We could render that out as one 96 bar loop, and just trigger it once when we, you know, hit pattern 1 and let it just run for the entirety of the song. You know what, it's an option. Let's create the sample for it anyway. So we'll create this as 6 pad 1 shot. And what did we say? I think it was 96 bars. Just in case, like if we reassemble this in the Octatrack and it's like, oh, this is ugly because that drone part that used to flow slowly and nicely is now sort of, you know, artificially jerking between 2 very obvious patterns. We can just say, okay, fine, we'll trigger it once on pattern 1 and let it run for the entire track. The downside of that is, though, if you want the flexibility of saying, well, when I play live, I'm going to play pattern 4, then pattern 3, and pattern 3, maybe I'll do it for 3 times in the 3 loops, and then whatever else. Maybe I won't even start on pattern 1, I'll start on pattern 6, and then loop, you know, come around and play pattern 2. You lose the flexibility to do that, because if you don't start, when you're playing the song, if you don't start it from pattern 1, you won't trigger this long-running one-shot sample. Okay, so it's a trade-off. But we've rendered out both samples to give ourselves the flexibility to decide how we're going to do it. Now this little 303 line, it's kind of rubbish, but it's there anyway. We're done with the pad. Sample this section, and you know, this I think is pretty out of time, but let's take a listen. Yeah, it's not much of anything. Does it get any louder along here? Okay, so yeah, it gets louder in there. To be honest, I'm not actually sure I really want that. Let's do this. I think we need a quiet, let's use the quiet version of it in part 1. Let's render out this sort of squelchy a bit for part 2, just for that pattern. What's it like here in part 4? It's quiet again. Builds up a little bit. Yeah, to be honest, I mean, the track's already quite far down, and it's something that I haven't put a lot of attention into, and I don't feel it's particularly central to this song. So what I'm going to do is, let's just do 2 versions of it. let's render out this 8 bars as, what should we call this? And we'll just call this one soft, and it's 4 bars. No, it's 8 bars. And then I think we said we'd take this one. Yeah, let's output this. And we've got them. Squelch. All right, we are done. We have cut up all the loops that we need to reassemble this in the Octatrack. There is also this group here that was just miscellaneous and noise stuff that I didn't end up using when, you know, things start off in clips here and then they get arranged, and those clips I didn't end up using. Expand these back out because we'll be sort of using this as a visual reference as we reassemble things on the Octatrack. Let's just take a quick look at the number of samples that we actually created here. So how many did I create? 14. Okay, that's pretty cool. Remembering you have 128 sample slots for your entire project, and for this project I've already got 5 songs sequenced on 5 banks, and this is going to be a 6th one. I think that's about all that's going to fit. But anyway, let's switch now to the Octatrack. Okay, here we are. First thing I'm going to do is make sure this is plugged into USB. It is. Now, which project have I got loaded? Okay, this is the right project, and I'm going to go into Project, System, USB Disk Mode. So that puts us in disk mode so that we can now easily load these samples. Let's switch back to the Mac for a second. All right, so in my computer I now have this Octatrack drive, and it is this project. In each project, it creates this audio folder, which is sort of the pool of audio samples for that project. Create a new folder for this song. It is indeed song number 6 that we're sequencing in for this project. And then just drag and drop all these samples. Let them copy. Okay, they have copied. Go back to the drive, eject the drive. Now we switch back to the Octatrack here. It straight away kicks itself out of USB disk mode and reloads the project. And now we're ready to start assembling things on the Octatrack, which is a really cool position to be in. Now in this project, I've already got banks 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for the first 5 songs that I've already assembled in this project. So we're going to be working in bank 6. So we'll start off, we're in bank 6, track 1. Now it's completely clean. We've got no other patterns defined. We've got now 4 parts to use, so we have clean slate here. There shouldn't be any trigs. Let's just make sure it doesn't make any noise. It makes no noise. Brilliant. All right, let's go about assembling this. Now, the whole time I'm doing this, I'm using the I've got Ableton in front of me here, and I've got the Octatrack down here. And so let's try, I'm working with OBS on the fly here. This could be a terrible mistake, but I want you to be able to see what I'm seeing in Ableton as well, because we're going to be cross-referencing it. All right, what I'm going to try and do is add a little picture-in-picture here. All right, we'll add the display capture, add our existing display, Ableton display. Okay. Now maybe if I can just add this up in the top corner. Sorry about this, I really should have thought about this ahead of time. Now I want you to be able to see all the buttons and stuff on the Octatrack, so it's going to be a little bit hard to see, but it'll do for now. In fact, you know what, we're not going to be using those encoders much, so let's sacrifice that for a little bit more screen real estate. Okay, I think we're good now. Let's get started. What we're going to do is start with pattern 1. Now pattern 1 in Ableton here just had that drone and that little 303 weird background pattern. So let's do that. First thing we need to think of is how we're going to assign each of these tracks to these groups of things that we had in Ableton. Remember, in Ableton I've got the drums, the lead 1, the lead 2, the bass, the pads, and the 303. I encourage you to find your own sort of little idiosyncrasies of how you like to treat the tracks in the Octatrack. One thing I do is track 5 is always my drum track. The reason for that is when I'm playing, especially if I'm playing live, it's usually the drum track that I might have to make a really quick adjustment to the levels or the sound on. And so I always just know if I hit track 5 up in the top right there, that's my drums. I can quickly fiddle with the levels or whatever I need to do. I also tend to gravitate towards track 1 being for bass, 2 and 3 for the lead parts, 4 for pads, and then 6 is typically my one-shots or anything else in the project. Actually, it's going to be interesting in this case to see what we do with the one-shots and fills, but we'll deal with that when we come to it. I think I've got an idea of how to deal with those. So I'm going to do track 1 bass, track 2 lead 1, track 3 lead 2, track 4 is going to be let's do track 4 as the pad, track 5 as drums, track 6 as the 303. So for pattern 1, all we've got is the pad and the 303. So where did I say? Track 4. So what we need to do now is we need to load up all these samples that we just made into slots in the flex pool, in the pool of samples that we're reading directly off the CF card. And there's kind of a neat way to do this. So I double tap the track and that brings up my my slot list. Now because I've already got 5 other songs on here, the slot list is like already quite full. I'm up to slot 94 already, but 94, 14 samples, 128 slots. I'm going to just make it. So I scroll here using the level encoder, or I could use the arrow keys to my first available slot, which is 94. Press the right arrow. That takes me to the directory structure on my CF card. I select the folder where we jumped all those samples, and here's our list of samples. Now, neat little trick. If I keep pressing the right arrow, that selects that sample to load, moves to the next slot, right arrow again, selects the next sample in the directory, right arrow again, loads it and goes to the next slot. And so you just in rapid succession keep pressing the right arrow, and that goes next slot, next sample, next slot, next sample, next slot, next sample. Really cool way to load these quickly, but make sure you don't get stuck in a loop of just constantly loading the same stuff. So just pay attention that you're not at the end of your samples yet. Okay, and there we go. So I see here part 4, and I know I've already loaded part 4. So let's just make sure we got all 14 samples that start with 6. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 30. Yeah, so we've got all 14 samples. Great, they're all loaded. Now what we were actually doing here before that little detour to load the samples was loading up the first sample that we want here, which is our pad. Right. So remember how I said like the display is super small? Sorry, you can't quite see it here because the lighting's not great, but I can only just see 6-BS-main-4, and it scrolls a little bit. So if I'd named these long things like drum track, snare, kick, hi-hat, pattern 5, you'd never be able to see it, and you get lost in which samples are which. So this is why the mnemonics are really helpful. So this is pad part 1. So yes to load that to that slot. That's now loaded. That sample to track 4 in the part button. We confirm we're in part 1. Now I'm going to go grid mode, hit a trigger on there, and now I'm actually ready to play. Let's have headphones on to listen. And that is indeed our pad. Now the thing is, I've put one trigger here. But if you look at the page section here, I've only got one LED lit here. That means it's only running one page at the moment of 16 steps. That's not enough to construct what we need here, which is an 8-bar pattern. The function page, and we set our pattern scale to be 64 of 64, so 64 full steps. Now that would be 4 bars at 16th notes, but I'm going to set the speed here to half instead of 1, and that gives me 64 steps, but each step is now an eighth note, which means 8 bars. Okay, it's all math. I assure you it all works out, and if it doesn't, focus on what I mean, not what I say. So we get out of page mode, and now one thing to remember is, and this is a setting in the Octatrack you can turn off, but by default, when you extend the number of pages or the number of steps you've got here for your patterns, it goes and copies the patterns that you had to those other pages, and that's not actually what we want here. I don't want this to keep re-triggering in every page, so I'm just going to turn those triggers off. Okay, we should now have pattern 1 sequenced such that it kicks off this 8-bar sample at the start of the pattern and then lets that run for 8 bars. Let's see. It's definitely quiet, but it is doing exactly that. And it loops back around. It's not the cleanest on the loop. We can tidy that up a little bit later by maybe adding some attack or whatever else. Stay out of record mode as much as you can, otherwise you do dumb things like I did the other day where you're in record mode and you go to change a pattern, you accidentally add a trig, you don't notice, and all of a sudden you're at a gig and you wonder why your drums start all out of time. Stay out of record mode at as much as you can. Right, what else do we need in pattern 1? In pattern 1 we also need that 303 line. We said that was going to be on track 6. Track 6, load the sample. And what did we call that? 303 8-bar soft. There it is. And same sort of thing here. Go into record mode, or grid mode it is. Set a trigger on that first page, first step. And just listen. And it is definitely there. I mean, it's very quiet, which is what we want because I'm not in love with that sample anyway. So if I just mute the other tracks, it is definitely there. And I was muting those by holding down function and hitting each of the tracks. Okay, so we're actually done now for pattern 1. So pattern 1, if we look up here in Ableton, it was just that drone and that bass line. Now pattern 2 is exactly the same in terms of it's the same part, and it's actually the same drone and bass again. So what we're going to do is get out of record and we hit function copy, switch to pattern 2, paste it. And now we're in pattern 2 and it's going to sound exactly like pattern 1. But in pattern 2 we start bringing in this the soft part of the first lead part. We said lead 2 was going to be here, so let's load the right sample for that. It was lead 1. Use the level button to, the level knob to scroll really fast through your list of slots. And this was lead 1 soft. Grid mode, trigger on the first step of the first page. There we go. And that's also running for 8 bars as well. There's no sense in doing like a per track length here such that, you know, one track is looping over a 4-bar sample and the other part's looping over the full 8, because all of these samples so far are 8 bars. I'll show you why that might be useful when we get to doing the drums, which is right now. So pattern 3, looking at Ableton again here, it's additive from pattern 2. So we're in pattern 2. I'm going to copy that, move to pattern 3, paste it, make sure it sounds right. Yep, sounds just like pattern 2 so far, but we're going to add in the drums. Double tap that, load our sample into this track for the drums. And it was 6 drum simple 2-bar. Okay, we're done. Grid mode, first sample, first page, and load the drums. Now, this is where things are going to get interesting. So let's play this and see what happens. So the drums triggered and played, but they're only playing for the first I guess 2 bars of our 4 bar pattern, because that's right, because each of these pages is 2 bars. So here's an interesting thing I can do. At the moment, the way this pattern is set up is that it is essentially set up such that it is a pattern that runs for 8 bars across all the tracks. Now that's fine when our drone or pad and our 303 line is an 8 bar loop. Now we've got a mix of a 2 bar loop for the drums playing against 8 bar loops for the other parts. 2 ways I can do this, right? We could just go ahead through each of these pages and add another trigger so it restarts playing that 2 bar drum loop at the start of the page, which is 2 bars. So play that back. And sure enough, you know, we've got what we wanted. We've got our drums playing again and again. But see, this limits my flexibility a little bit. Let's say I wanted to get crazy and actually take that 2 bar drum loop, slice it up into say, let's say 32 slices. That would be, you know, each slice would be a 16th note, and then jumble it up completely. Well, I'd be limited here because I'd actually be having to make that 2 bars fit into the 64 slices across 8 bars, which means instead of working in the resolution of 16th notes, I'm working in 8th notes. And so when I slice that up and want to rearrange it, I'd be getting sort of an 8th bar chunks to work, 8th note chunks to work with instead of 16th notes. And maybe that'll be okay, but it's not as clean as I'd like it to be. So I'm going to do something really cool here. Our track for the lead and the pad are both 8 bar samples. They're fine. The track for the drums is a 2 bar sample. Watch this. We're going to in project, and no, sorry, not in project. We're going to hit function pattern settings. And under pattern here, I'm going to say scale mode is per track. Now, what this means is with that set, when I go into the page settings here, every single track allows me to set a different number of steps for that track and speed for that track, as well as a master number of steps for the entire pattern. Amazing. This is what makes the Octatrack so freaking cool to work with, because now I can have my 8 bar loops running end to end over this pattern. And then over the top, I can have my 2 bar loop running and starting again and again. But it's actually not just triggering again and again over this 8 bar section. It's like that whole 2 bar sample has its own 64 steps to work with, where each step is a 16th note. And you're probably sitting back and going, that made no sense at all, but hopefully it will when I show you what I'm going to do here. So let's get down to the money here. Let's get out of page mode. The first thing we need to do is just set things back up again for the those 8 bar loops that were for the lead. What did we have? We had the lead, the pad, and the 303. So lead first. Notice it's going back to only having 1 page here. So open up the page settings. This is an 8 bar loop, so I want all 64 steps, but I want them to run at half speed. That's 8 bars. Likewise for this track. 64 steps, half speed. Same for the 303, 64 steps, half speed. And now watch what we can do. For the drum track, it's only 32 steps because it's 2 bars at 1 time speed, right? 64 steps is 4 bars of 16th notes. 32 steps at full speed is 2 bars of 16th notes. Trust me, the math makes sense. One thing we need to do here on the display, it lists our steps here, 32 of 32, and our speed 1 time. We can set the master here as well. Now for the master, I'm actually going to set this to 128 steps at 1 speed. Why is that? Again, check my math. Typically when you're working with 4 bar patterns, it's a 64 step pattern at full speed at 1 time speed, 64 steps, 64 16th notes, 4 bars. In this case, I've actually got 8 bars. So it's 128 steps at 1 speed, which is what I've set on the display here. So just to be clear, the display says 32 of 32 at 1 speed for this track, and the master for this whole pattern is 128 steps at 1 speed. It all works out. Get out a pen and paper, and once you do this, it'll make sense to you, believe me. It's so powerful the way this works in the Octatrack, because now what we do, if we get out of page mode, when I'm in grid, all I need to do is set one trigger for this, which is going to run that drum loop through the first bar here, 16 steps, and keep it running because it's a 2-bar for the next 16 steps. Let's see if this all worked out. Double check our work here. We're in grid mode. So the lead triggers once. See, this is why you double check your work. I only want that to trigger once at the start because it's an 8-bar loop, not again at each page. Same for the pad. Got to be careful of this because it copies those pages for you when you add more, and so always go and double check your work. And the drums is just one trigger on page 1. And that's, I think, all we have set up. We haven't set up this track. We haven't set up track 3. And we've set up 5 and 6. So 2, 4, 5, and 6. Yeah, 6 we need to check our work here. So the 303, same thing. Only trigger first step of the pattern. Okay, let's listen. Cool. So that works. We now have our 8-bar pattern reconstructed from a combination of 8-bar loops as well as a single 2-bar loop by using per track scale settings. Very cool. Love the Octatrack. But let's get moving because this is definitely the longest video ever. All right, we've done pattern 3. Now pattern 4, looking at Ableton here, is when we've actually, in pattern 4, we start a new part. So well, actually, can we copy? Oh wait, sorry, we're not done with pattern 3. Pattern 3 also brings in the bass line. So pattern 3, bass is track 1. Load the bass sample. There it is. Yes, there's only one of them. That's nice and simple. Back to the track, grid mode. Set our page length. Set your page length before you add a trigger. It avoids that copying problem. This is an 8-bar track, so it's 64 steps, half speed. One trigger at the start. Let's see. Oh yeah. Okay, we're done with part 3. So, sorry, we're done with pattern 3. We're going to move on now to pattern 4. Now, although this is a different part, there is some commonality here. Like, for example, the bass line is the same. The 303 part is different. The drums are different. Yeah, you know what? Let's not copy. Let's set this up from scratch. Let's move to pattern 4. Hit our part button and go to part 2. So we're going to start a new part now because we're bringing in a different set of samples from the last couple of patterns we did. We're ready to go. Pattern 4, part 2. Let's go. Let's do the bass first. It's the same bass because we only have one bass sample, but because you're in a new part now, you have to set the bass sample again. Different part, different set of samples. Copy that, so we've got the bass there. Now, how am I going to do this one? We're going to do this per track scaling again. So pattern settings. Oops, nope, sorry. Pattern settings, per track timing. The bass is an 8-bar loop, so 64 steps. Whoops. 64 steps at half speed. Master is 128 steps because it is still an 8-bar overall pattern. Yep, that's that done. And we just want one trigger, nothing else on the other pages. Okay, that's our bass line there. Lead 1, do we have anything for lead 1? Of course we do. So lead 1 has the busy part to it now. So scroll through our sample list here. lead one, what did we call it? Lead one, both. That's right, because it's got both the parts playing. So that's lead one, both sample loaded. This one again is a 8-bar loop, so it is 64 steps half speed. And set one trigger. Take a listen. Yep, that's what we want. There's no lead 2 part yet, or track. For the pad there is, I think we created a new sample for this, so let's see, 6 pad part 2, yep we did. That's that sample loaded, and again 8-bar, so 64 steps, half speed, that means 8 bars. One trigger at the start of that 8 bars, play that 8-bar loop. There's our pad coming in. Drums are a new sample because we've got that real busy drum beat playing. So we select our sample that we call drum busy. Now it's a 2-bar sample, so we do things a little bit different this time. In our timing here, we want 32 steps at full speed, which is 2 bars, but still one trigger across the 2 pages. Beautiful. And the 303 line that I don't like, I'm tempted to drop it, but let's just keep it in there. 6303, oops, no, I'm in the wrong song. It was called 6303, and let's use the squelchy one this time because we're in a different part. So it's that sample, it's an 8-bar sample, so 64 steps. Oops, I'm getting bad with this key. 64 steps at half speed, one trigger on the first page. Okay, I think we're done with this pattern. Did I mention I'm not loving that 303 line? I need to re-record it in time. It's weirdly out of time. That's it for pattern 4. Is that right? Pattern 4 part 2, complicated drum part. We did the both part for lead. There's no lead 2. We've got the same bass line playing. We used the drone or the pad loop for part 2 and the 303 part for pad 2. Part 2. Well, that wasn't too bad, was it? Now pattern 5, looking at Ableton here, it's got a fair few similarities to what we've got in pattern 4. Like it's the same complicated drum beat or the busy drum beat. The lead one's a little bit different. The bass is the same. Looks like the drone is the same, or it might not be. It's actually a part 3 drone, and it's no 303 line. So just to do things quickly here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the pattern first. So I'm in pattern 4, copy pattern, pattern 5, paste it. So now we're in pattern 5. Make sure it sounds like we expect. Yep. But pattern 5 uses part 3. But part 3 is a lot like part 2. So open up part, copy, select part 3, part, paste. Paste on part 3. So we just copied part 2 to part 3. Now let's address the differences in part 3, which is the drums is the same, so no need to change there. The bass line's the same, no change. Lead 1's different. So lead 1 now switches to using just the loud. So that's that loop. And we don't need to adjust the triggers or anything because it's the same thing of using a 2-bar loop for the drums, 8-bar for everything else. So by copying that pattern, all of that was done for us, which is a really great time saver. We just need to address the difference in the samples. So drums are the same, lead part is different, we just changed that out. Bass is the same. What did we do for the drone pad? I think we had a different part for that because that's right. We had parts 1, 2, 3, 4. So switch the sample to the one we want to use for part 3. Drums don't change, and the 303 we actually have nothing here, so we're not going to trigger it at all. So That's one thing we need to do, is just turn off triggers for any tracks in this pattern that we don't want. So pattern 5 does not have the 303 playing, but that's the only track that we dropped. So let's take a listen. Sounds right to me at a glance. Now pattern 6 is where things do get quite different in terms of we'll be able to hear a difference, but it's the same part, and so what we'll do is we're in pattern 5, copy, pattern 6, paste. We're now in pattern 6. Sounds a lot like pattern 5 did, but we're going to change that right now because the drums don't play at all. So let's turn that trigger off. Lead 1 doesn't play. Oh no, lead 1 does play. Yes. Lead 2. Finally, we have lead 2. So let's set our lead 2 sample. And there it is, lead 2 main, 8 bars. Set up our timing on this. It's 64 steps at half speed because it's 8 bars. You sensing the pattern yet? Grid mode, set the trigger on just the first page to kick off that sample. What else changes? The bass isn't playing in this pattern, so track 1, turn off the trigger for that. And the 303 isn't playing either. Yay! I already turned that off, did I? I did. Cool. Let's listen. Yep, that's what I'm expecting. Then we go into pattern 7, and this is another part again, part 4. Now, if you remember, part 4 was a lot like part 2. It had that simple, it's got the simple drums, the lead's different, but the bass, the drone, and everything else is the same. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go to, how should we do this? Yeah, let's do this. Let's go pattern 3, which is the last time we used part 1. Pattern 3 I'm going to copy. Part 7 is what we want to make. I'm going to paste it. So I just copied from 3 to 7. Be super careful when you do this, and remember there is a way to undo pastes in the Octatrack. You just paste again. So I did that paste. If I paste again, it says undo pattern. Okay, learned that one the hard way as well. Let's repeat what we did. We're in pattern 7, but we want pattern 7 to look a lot like pattern 3. Pattern 3, copy, pattern 7, paste, done. Let's just see what it sounds like. It's got that simple drum beat, and it sounds a lot like the start of the song did, which is what we want. But what we do want is we want to actually make this part 4 though, so that we can make some change to which samples are used. Again, I'm going to copy the part because we're in part 1 now, and part 4 sounds a lot like part 1. So copy part 1. Part 4 is active now. Paste on part 4. So great. Now we're ready to go. So what's different now in part 4? It's that same drum beat. Lead 1 is in both mode. So we don't want the soft sample. We want lead 1 both. There's no lead 2. There wasn't in that other pattern anyway, so I don't need to change anything. There's no bass playing, which is different from the pattern that we just copied from. So let's go to the bass, turn that trigger off. Otherwise, we know that for the drone, we recorded a different loop for each part. So I'm going to set this now to be the part 4 loop. Again, we still want it triggered, and the 303 is actually not playing at all. Yay! Drums are playing. Yes. Okay, let's have a listen. I should be hearing the simple drums, both parts of the lead 1, no lead 2, no bass. The pad should be there. Oh, actually, no, part 7, the 303 should be there. My mistake. Let's turn that trigger on. The sample, yeah, I just want the soft one. Okay. Yeah, that's what I want. Now we go to pattern 8. Now pattern 8's using part 2, so let's copy it from, and it looks a whole lot like pattern 4 when I glance up here at Ableton. So pattern 4, copy, pattern 8, paste, check the parts right. There's a little bug in the Octatrack where when you copy a pattern like that, the display will tell you the wrong part at first. This is why I'm kind of nervous, twitchy about always hitting the stop button and sometimes just hitting play and then stop. That just seems to kick things into gear and shows the right part, which is part 2, which is correct because we're in pattern 8 now. We copied it from pattern 4, which was using part 2. So we're in pattern 8, part 2, correct? Yes. And the structure for that is we've got the complicated drums, which is right, it's the busy pattern. The bass is our same old main pattern, and we want that triggered, yep. Lead 1 is the both sample. Yep, that's load the right one. Oh, you know what, the samples are all right, yeah, because we're back to part 2 here, so I don't need to do any changing around here. I just need to make sure I got the right triggers set up. So I do want the bass triggered. We do want lead 1 triggered. We do not want lead 3 triggered. We do want the pad triggered, and we want the drums triggered, yep, and the 303 triggers, yep. Okay, let's have a listen. Yep, that definitely sounds like what we want in part 8. Nearly there, fellas. We're in pattern 8. We've got 2 to go. Now, pattern 9 is sort of when we're starting to, bring everything back down. And for that reason, it actually looks a lot like part 2 because it's just the bass, just the pad, and just the 303. So, pattern 2, copy, pattern 9, paste. Quick play and stop to just reset everything. Looks right. It says we're in part 1 here, which is what we want for pattern 9. We're in pattern 9. And the only thing I want triggered in pattern 9 is I do not want the bass triggered, which is right already. I do want lead 1 triggered, as in I want that sample to be running. There's no lead 2. The pad plays, yes, and against my better judgment, the 303 line plays, but the drums do not, which is already there because we copied it from pattern 2, which is what it looks a lot like. Let's listen. Yeah, that's the song starting to wind down. Now pattern 10 is even simpler, so I'm just going to go copy pattern 9, so pattern 10, paste. We're there. All right. Now in pattern 10, we just got to turn off some triggers because there's some samples we don't want to have playing. So grid edit mode. No trigger on pattern 1. We don't want the bass playing. We don't even want the lead playing anymore. We definitely don't want lead 2. We just want the pad playing. We don't want any drums, that's off. And we want the god-awful 303 line playing. And that's it, because if we look here up at Ableton, we've just got right down to just the pad and just the 303 playing. Cool, I think that's it. Let's have a listen to just part 10, pattern 10. Yeah, that's it. Okay, so in theory, we now have our song reconstructed here on the Octatrack. Let's have a listen. This is the bit where you find all the little glitches where the samples, maybe when it loops, there's a noticeable dynamic difference at the start and other things you need to smooth over. But ultimately, this should kind of feel like the same song as it was that we were playing in Ableton. Let's have a run through of it. So pattern 1, and let's kick it off. Notice I'm just hitting pattern to have it progress, so it's going to move after this to pattern 2. Pattern 2 comes in, I'm going to say next move to pattern 3. a little bit weird there. Let's stop it. So we're in pattern 3. We lose our bass part. Now remind me, in the pattern settings for this, we're using per track. Our bass is on track 1. This looks right. I've got it set to being 64 steps at half speed. So why did we lose our bass there? It could be, I mean, maybe I was wrong. Maybe oh, you know what, I am wrong. Let's double check. When the bass is not an 8-bar pattern at all, is it? It's a 4-bar pattern. Let's double check. You know what? This is exactly why I go and put the bar number in the file name, because sure enough, when I go and open up which sample I've got assigned here, it tells me 6 bass main 4-bar. So user error, it's the bass is not 8 bars, it's 4 bars. But that's cool because we're in per track mode here for the scale. So let's correct this error. So function page, the page settings here, I don't want this to be 64 steps at half speed, it's 64 steps at full speed, which is 4 bars. Let's play this back now. Awesome. So we're not losing the bass there. It's cycling properly through the 4-bar loop over the top of the longer 8-bar loops, and also with the 2-bar loop of drums playing Octatrack magic. Now the thing is, I've obviously made this error all throughout this construction, but the really great thing about the Octatrack is the hierarchy of how it's put together and how it remembers where you are and lets you sort of just cut across the grain of certain parts of the operation of the machine. I'll give you an example of what I mean here. Right now I'm in pattern 3 and I've realized that I've made a mistake in track 1 across the board here. So I'm going to go back to pattern 1. I've got track 1 selected and I'm going to open up the scale page. What I can do is I can correct this really quickly by just saying it's not 64 steps at half speed, it's at 1 speed. And then switch to the next pattern, correct it. Oh, we'd already corrected pattern 3, hadn't we? Pattern 4, change it to 1 speed, and I'm just cycling through each pattern here, fixing the speed, and we're done. You know, other things you'd have to be like stepping through all these pages and trying to work out where you are and resetting, you know, select this and now change the speed. And it's just, I love the way the Octatrack is built and engineered in such a way that it just kind of feels like it knows where you are and it remembers where you are, such that, you know, when you suddenly want to make a wide sweeping change across a bunch of patterns, it's easy to do so. It's just a fantastic box. Okay, let's continue our listen. So we're on pattern 3 here. Move on to pattern 4 after this. Page LEDs here that show you sort of where it's at in terms of scrolling through this. Like each page here is 2 bars because this is an 8-bar loop. If you change to a track that's got a different timing, notice this is progressing faster. So this gives you a sense of where it's at in that loop versus the longer loop that it's playing versus the shorter loop that it's playing. Like the drums, for example. It's just cycling through these 2 pages, those 2 bars. Whereas this track is cycling through 2 bars per page. So it's, you know, it's important to know which track you've got selected if you're trying to orient yourself as to where your song's at. Right, let's move on to pattern 6. Things are sounding okay so far. Pattern 7 next. on pattern 10 is the end. And we could just like let this loop out here while we transition on to the next pattern. So there we go. It's about an hour and 25 minutes of work, but we completely deconstructed a song out of Ableton into 10 different patterns, 4 different parts, and reconstructed it as is on the Octatrack using various techniques. The one that's probably the hardest to get your head around is the per track scale, but it's really powerful, especially when you've got loops of varying length. Now, one thing I did say is, that allowed me ultimate flexibility. Let's just save our project here. Let me show you what I meant by that before we round out this video, because obviously, cynically, you could sit back and go, well, that's great, dude. You just took a song that you could hit play of, play in Ableton to play, and now you can do the same thing on a $1,200 Octatrack. Great achievement. The thing about this is the flexibility and the power you have now, and the ability to step away from the laptop and start to see this song under a different light. For example, let's take this, let's just choose pattern 6. Actually, that's a bad example. I just got that blippy lead. Okay, let's say I wasn't thrilled with that drum line, which I'm not. Let's change it up completely. Track 5. Now, at the moment, what we've got here in our triggers is just one trigger at the start of these 2 bars. So it just plays that sample and lets the sample run onto the next page, and then comes around again and starts the sample again. Well, but we've got 32 steps here to play with. What if we wanted to sequence each of them individually? We can. Now, this is a little bit complicated, but it's simple enough when you think through what you're doing. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on each of these steps. You'll see why in a second. Probably an easier way to do this, but I love pressing these buttons. So now all my steps are on. If I play this as is, what it means is it's going to be restarting this sample at each of these steps, which is probably not what we want at all. Let's play. It certainly is different. What I actually want to do is slice this sample up. And I want to slice it up into 32 slices so that each of these buttons is playing an individual little slice of that sample in linear order, to start with anyway. So I'm going to open up the sample list here, and I'm on got the right sample selected for this busy drum part. I'm going to open up the audio editor, hit the slice option, and say, yes, I want to slice that. And say, create slice grid. And I would like 32 slices, please, sir. Yep. Boom. I've now got that 2-bar loop sliced into 32 slices that I can assign to each of these pages. Magic. A few other little things we need to do first. Now, it's great that we've got that sliced, but that's not the end of the story, because if we play this now, it's still doing that. Why is it doing that? Because if we go into hold down function and hit source here, the settings for this static machine is that slice mode is off. So now we turn that slice mode is on because we want to say we want to address that sample by individual slices, not just the entire sample itself. But there's one other thing we need to do, because although this track now understands we want to work with samples, we are still playing the first sample on each of these buttons. Now, what you could do is you could hold down each of these buttons, use the encoder knob up here to say that the start is actually slice 2, and this one's slice 3, and this one's slice 4. That gets really tiring really fast. It achieves what we want. Like if we listen, there should now be a little bit of variation. Okay, but that's literally going to take us all day to do. Well, not all day, but it's finicky and tedious. What I'm going to do is open up the sample again, go into my audio editor. In the slice menu here, I'm going to say, I think it's under here, yes, create linear locks. Say yes, alter trigs, yes. And what that goes and does, notice how these are all flashing in that really cool color of sort of this quick blink of green on red. That means it just went and applied a lock to all of these patterns across both pages such that that's slice 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, all the way up 16 to 32 on the second page, so that now when we hit play, it's that drum loop exactly as it was when we were just triggering it once and letting it through. So now we're sort of back at a stable starting point that we can start messing things around. For example, you know, and this is where like the real happy accidents of this all comes in. You can just select a particular button here and say, for this step, I actually want it to play a different slice. So I'm literally at random just picking steps here and twiddling the knob for the slice number, or the start parameter, I should say, to pick a different slice for some of these steps. So now when we play it back, it's a mess, but it's a start, right? And in fact, that's probably a little bit too dramatically different. So just to reset ourselves, I can go back into the audio editor, slice mode, yes, create linear locks again, alter the trigs, yes, and out of audio editor. And that just reset things nicely, because maybe it's just the end of the song here, and I just wanted to make it simple again. And so I maybe just say that for steps 13, 14, 15, I actually want it to do slices 1, 2, 3, 4, so that it just kind of feels like the start of the song. Well, that's the start of that loop, rather than the busy bit at the end. Let's play it. Okay, so it took some of the complexity out there. So, you know, there's lots of things you can do here. One neat trick, if you really want to, I mean, it probably doesn't work too well for a drum loop, but if you were slicing up, say, a melodic part and you just wanted to start with something completely different, what you can do is also go into the audio editor again, slice menu. Instead of create linear locks, you say create random locks. Alter the trigs, yes. And now, all of these 32 steps across these 2 pages, well, they're actually, they're going to be doing like the entire, it's just an entire jumble of, each step is a different slice. And so we listen. Obviously super different. But it gives us a starting point to work from. Like we could, you know, look at each of these and see which sample number it is, and make our changes accordingly. All right, that's it for this video, or at least one last thing I'm going to show you. Remember how I saved the project before I started messing around with that? The reason was because I wanted to be able to reset to that sort of clean point. And remember, the Octatrack saves as you go, sort of in like a working memory. If I turned the Octatrack off now and turned it back on, it will remember all these random locks that we just did. Then there's also the step of saving the project. And that allows you to do this, which is in the project menu, we say reload project. All changes since the last save state will be lost. Continue, yes. And it's now reloading our project from scratch. Not from scratch, but from the point where we saved after we'd finished our construction. And so play it back. And we're back to where we want it to be. All right, enjoy.